This is the Spiritual Hacking Conference call, and it is a great way to start off your work week with some spiritual tips and insight and to get some positivity as we head into our work weeks for us. So this is action-packed, first week of December. I can't believe it. And I'm excited about today's topic. So I'm Avraham Calhoun, for those of you who are new with us on the call. And this is the Spiritual Hacking Conference call. And today we are basically going to be talking about power differentiation and how organizations govern themselves and some of the challenges that the way in which you are governing organizations today are in direct conflict with our own societal values. So let's just kind of jump right into the topic. So when I was doing research for this, trying to find out what is the closest form of government, the way in which most organizations and companies are run today, and it was really, really hard to dig up specifically a definite type of government that is being utilized within an organizational space. What I did find, however, is that our federal government has set some standards as it relates to our merit-based system. So all of our federal agencies are run on a merit-based system, and in a way, this has also influenced the way in which organizations and businesses outside of the federal government are also operating. So on this merit-based system, there are 5 main areas that need to be considered when you are building organizational culture and management. And that first one is planning. That every individual in a role has the ability and the knowledge they need in order to plan and complete those plans on schedule, if you will. So if you're working on a project or you're working on a budget, right, making sure you have the tools to actually put that plan together. From there, there's a level of monitoring, right? So this aspect of someone checking in on the individual in a certain role, making sure that they're performing at their best level as much as possible. Then there is the idea of development, right? Making sure that everyone has access to the right training and education that they need in order to excel in their role. From there, you have appraising, this kind of conversation of figuring out, okay, who's actually doing the jobs that we want them to do in the right way and who is not really pulling their weight. And are we making sure we're retaining those employees that are actually doing well? And then, quite frankly, getting rid of those employees that are not necessarily pulling their own weight. And then finally, you have the rewarding. You have the aspect of making sure that when someone is earned a raise, someone has earned a promotion, etc., you're making sure that you're rewarding them. So in a merit-based system, you have planning, you have monitoring, you have developing, you have appraising, and you have rewarding. And now you will find many of these same categories within most workspaces or businesses today. So what I really find interesting here, specifically about building organizational culture and why I take a spiritual approach to conflict resolution and emotional intelligence in the workspace, is because of this one thing. When you are setting any sort of standards and or culture, but you are not recognizing the law of entropy and human ego, your system or your culture is doomed to fail. And here's why. Because when you think about energy and you think about entropy, this idea that energy cannot be created or destroyed. So any energy, so we're using energy at all times of the day, through our thoughts, our behaviors, our speech, whatever it may be. Everything we're doing is energy. And when my energy goes unchecked, it will then spiral into this sort of chaotic, ego-driven nature. And so what's happening is that we're setting these big organizational cultures and or values like honesty and respect, or a merit-based system, planning and monitoring, developing and appraising, but we're not actually taking into consideration that human beings are fundamentally flawed. We have ego. We are selfish creatures. It's not necessarily good or bad in its basic essence, but it becomes negative when you put everyone's egos together in a space. So what we need to understand is that if we're building any sort of organizational culture, any sort of power structure, we need to understand that human beings are fundamentally flawed. I'm not saying that you can't rely on people, but I think when we set these organizational cultures and systems into place, we're expecting that people are going to do the right thing. And that's a great thought to have, but the reality is that people don't innately do the right thing even when they have systems, because we're not taught about the ego. We're not taught about this idea of entropy, that if we are not controlling our energy, if we're not learning how to restrict our energy, then we are going to always spiral into a sense of egotistical and or selfish behavior. So when we look at the way in which organizations are being run right now, especially with setting these lofty cultural ideas, if they're not actually incorporating this idea of ego, working against the ego, restricting the ego, teaching people how to understand their ego and restrict it, then they're doomed to fail. And even further, what's so interesting when you look at the way in which organizations are run, and most businesses are run in the United States, but you think about our own governmental system, we are a democracy. But when you look at most organizations, they're organized, and I took this also from this one study. What was it called? I want to give you all the name of the study. Give me 1 second. So they looked at perspectives of power in organizations. It's by Anderson and Brion. I'd be happy to give you the source if you're interested. But when they were looking at how power was structured in organizations, they found that many organizations are structured like authoritarianships or dictatorships. Not necessarily bad and or good in their essence, but of course when you start to get human ego, problems start to arise. And this is kind of antithetical to what we as Americans value when it comes to power. I mean, we are a very democratic society, right? But we go and we work in these spaces that are organized much like authoritarianships and or organized like dictatorships, where power is concentrated with a small group of people at the top, and they make decisions without input. Not all the time. Some organizations are good at getting staff input, but some are not good at it. And they're just making decisions about the way in which people's work should be without actually including them in those conversations. Human ego, right? So these systems are doomed to fail if we're not actually taking into consideration that human ego is always at work. So there are three main areas that I want to look at when I'm working with any business or organization and trying to kind of figure out what the best strategy will be in order to reorganize the power structure and to give more voice in the organization. And the first one is looking at the power structure. And right now, most organizations are kind of in this area of authoritarianship and or dictatorships. The second one is organizational culture. And right now what you're seeing is a lot of staff conformity, and that culture allows those who are in power to cling to it. So the culture essentially serves those in power. And if you are not conforming to this culture, then you are going to either be cut or it's going to be tense for you at all times. And we notice in organizational culture, like when people go into work, they change the way that they talk, they change the way that they dress. They're changing these innate aspects about themselves in order to fit in a box in this workspace. It's quite dangerous to the self, because you start to get into this idea of self-denial, or you have to kind of switch how you act with people inside of work and people outside of work, because of the professional world that we've built around dress code, speech, things that are okay to talk about, things that are not okay to talk about. All of these are set in stone because people don't have good conflict resolution and emotional intelligence skills. But if people had these kinds of skills, we'd be able to be more free and authentic in ourselves in the workspace. So we've got organizational culture, we've got the power structure, and then the ownership of time. Who owns your time? And right now, it's this idea that the company owns the individual's time. Because I'm paying you for X number of hours a week, I get to tell you how you use those X number of hours a week, right? And I don't know about you, but look, I'm all for working and meeting the commitment of working a certain amount of hours in a week, but in the way that works best for me, not necessarily that works best for this organization that isn't even a human. It's an entity made up of many different humans, right? So what happens when you run organizations in the way that we're currently running them, where power is concentrated with small groups of people? There is a clear organizational culture, and you're either on the bus or off the bus if you don't get it. And company owns time rather than the individual owning time. You start to take away people's self-autonomy. You start to take away people's trust in their own abilities. And so there are 4 areas that I want to look at. Wisdom, respect, wealth, and strength. So when you have a strong group of a small, concentrated, small group of power, where if you're doing something good, it needs to come from them. If you're doing something bad, it needs to come from them. You're essentially sending a message to the entire team that the only opinion that matters is those above. Everyone else's opinion does not matter. And so if I'm an individual in the workspace and I'm doing a pretty decent job, but I'm not getting that validation or recognition from the top, then I'm going to start to doubt and lack in my own abilities. It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm actually not doing a good job. It's coming from this false perception that this negative culture in our workspaces and businesses are creating. And so when you start to get people to pay attention to lack, or you start to get them to pay attention to the ego talking to them, you're not good enough, you didn't finish that soon enough, you didn't dress right today, all of that ego starts to come into play. And when we're using our egos to navigate systems, we become petty, we become guarded, and closed off from making meaningful connections. So what we need to understand is when we don't have certainty in our own abilities, when we don't have certainty in our strengths, in our wealth, in our respect, in our wisdom, we are naturally going to allow other people to control the way we think about those core areas. And when we allow others to control the way we think about those core areas, we start to create this cycle of ego, right? Those at the top who are a small group of people holding power are utilizing their ego to control, and then those at the bottom are utilizing their ego to gain. And it creates this cycle of ego. So, in turn, what we see is this cycle creates petty professionalism, and it creates a lack of unity and collaboration in the workspace. So what do we need to do? How do we break this cycle? Well, first, I think it's important that the employees who have low power, here's some things that you can do. Those of you who have low power, you have to have full certainty in the self, right? You have to know and trust yourself that you're doing a good job. Trust yourself. At the end of the day, trust yourself. If you are doing a good job, if you're putting the effort in that you need to do, if you're hitting your marks, trust it. Stop seeking validation externally. And I know it's not easy as it is to say it, but it's something that we have to start practicing. We have to start taking our own power back in organizations. Understand what real power is. In this same study about perspectives of power in organization written by Anderson and Brion, they talk about power is asymmetrical control over valued resources, and it's the ability to get other people to behave and acquire things in the way that you want them to, right? So it's this idea of essentially being able to manipulate people. And who's controlling what resources? So finally, we want to look at what do you need to do if you're a person with low power in an organization, what do you need to do to become more valuable to your organization? You can play the game of power, right? But know that you've got to be checking your ego as you're playing the game of power. Why are you playing the game? Are you playing the game because you want to gain power in order to change it for the better, make positive changes? Or are you playing the game of power because you just want power and you want to control people? There are two different ways to play the game. So in order to gain more power, know that it's about valuable resources. So figure out what's valuable to that small group of people who are in power and start to gain some of that for yourself. And then the second thing is leave. Stop rewarding bad leadership in organizations. And I honestly am more for this one than the other one. Don't even play the game. If you're already working in a petty professional space where that has power is concentrated at the top, they don't listen, there's no voice of staff involved in decision making, stop rewarding them by giving them your time. Leave that organization, and the more that we start to do this, the better. But know that if you're going to be one of those people who is pushing back at some of the problems in the organization, you become an enemy to those who are in power. And so they're going to do everything that they can to kind of push you out the door as best as possible if they don't just flat out let you go. Now, employees who do have power, here's what you can do to start breaking this system. Fight your own ego and your desire to receive for the self alone, and really ask yourself the question, are these positive ways of being or these negative ways of being? Are we revealing more light for people? Are we revealing more peace and prosperity in people's lives? Or are we creating more stress, tension, fear, and negativity in the practices that we're doing? These are questions that we need to be asking ourselves. And I love this quote I wanted to read here about leadership. Leadership involves persuading other people to set aside for a period of time their individual concerns and to pursue a common goal that is important for the responsibilities and welfare of a group, right? So the difference between leadership and power is this idea I control a small group of resources. A small group of people controls the resources that are needed, whereas leadership is this idea of being able to motivate people to achieve an overarching goal. But if you don't have the relationship and the trust of these people, you can't even be a leader. So one of the things that they talk about in this paper about how leaders can start to create more synergy in the workspace is, in addition to achieving control over other valued resources, building their social networks by developing relationships with individuals from across their organizations is an effective strategy for managers to acquire power. This can be accomplished through engaging in shared activities, such as joining cross-functional teams, playing in the company's softball team, or taking part in recruitment activities. Right here, what they're talking about for power, if you want positive power, it is about the relationship that you have with people. So we have to get out of our egos and actually start developing productive, positive relationships with others. So we should all be striving for a workspace that has more spiritual values that are conducive to creating peace in the workspace. So actually, when we're looking at power structure, instead of having this authoritarian style of government, we really should embrace individual character and authenticity. There really shouldn't be a dress code. We shouldn't really change how we're speaking. We should be looking at power structures that are more closely aligned with egalitarianism and or democracy, right? Recognizing that all levels of voices matter on the job. So if a decision is going to impact a certain group of people, making sure that we're getting their input and giving them say in the decision, that's going to change the way in which their job works. Then we want to look at our organizational culture, right? What is the culture we're trying to spread? Are we trying to spread conformity, or are we trying to spread authenticity? And really what we should be seeking is authenticity, allowing people to be more authentic to themselves. So embracing individual character and not allowing dress code and in the way of speech to divide people. And further, rather than dividing responsibility based on job descriptions and hierarchy, we really should be basing it more on skill level and passion and interest. So Instead of saying like, okay, we have this marketing campaign, we're going to give it to the communications director. It may make sense. They probably do align with it a lot. But really rather saying, here's my entire team. We're trying to start this new communications campaign, and here are all of the goals that we need achieved. Now, let's take a look at my team. What are all of the skills and attributes and passions of my team, and how do I match them perfectly up to the different tasks on that list in order to achieve that goal? Because we want to make sure that people are feeling passionate, valued, and purposeful when they're doing work. And then finally, we really need to look at the ownership of time. I still own my time, even if you are paying me. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't have to work. Well, what I'm saying here is if I have 40 hours in a week to get a certain number of tasks done, then I should be able to decide how and which I'm doing that as long as I'm getting it done by the deadline. So if I work better from a, 11 to 7 time schedule, that should be totally fine as long as I'm getting the work done. And I know that there are some industries and whatnot that are not operating like that. I think I'm talking about our more general nonprofit management structures, businesses. But just the company respects the needs of the individual, right? There's not a need to approve time. And when possible, employee completes tasks using deadlines and exemplars, but actually has the freedom to do it when it's best for them. So this is what spiritual organizations can really start to look like if we work in this direction. This has been the Spiritual Hacking Conference Call. I'm Avraham Calhoun, and I hope you enjoyed this morning. I hope you all have a great day.